Okay, we're back, and let's start the category of coercive paraphilias by talking about voyeuristic disorder. You may have heard of this described as peeping Tom. This is a person who likes to watch other people while they are undressing or while they're having sex. And the key thing in voyeuristic disorder is that the person who is being observed needs to not know that they're being observed. They need to be victimized. They need to be being taken advantage of by the voyeur. It is not arousing enough for a person with voyeuristic disorder to, for example, watch pornography. Because the people in the pornography know that they're being watched. They're doing this behavior on purpose. The voyeur needs an unsuspecting person. Something that makes it more exciting is if there's a risk of discovery. So what you'll oftentimes find is that, peeping Toms who are just starting off, a lot of times this will be a teenager just starting off, they will catch a couple of glimpses through the hedge and into the window, and they're sort of hiding or they're passing by really quickly and they caught a glimpse, and this is very exciting, and it can serve, fuel fantasies for a while. But that starts to lose its power, and so then the person has to get a little closer to the window. Maybe start looking at this, the schedule of the person who they normally observe, and they know the voyeur will know when that victim is likely to be in that window undressing or doing whatever they're doing. And so the voyeur starts to really do sort of a little stalky behavior, right, where they're really tracking their victim and knowing when they're likely to catch a glimpse. They may get closer and closer to the window so that you end up with a picture like this one where the peeper is right up against the window. If she looked at the right time, she might see his face in the window. That's very arousing for a person who's getting closer and closer, right? Like escalating their behavior. Ultimately, when a peeping Tom is caught, a lot of times they've really escalated to the point where now they're willing to have broken into this person's house and hide inside the closet, or some other kind of situation where you might think, well, why would you do that? I mean, how did you not think you'd get caught? Well, part of the reason why is that they had been doing it from a bigger distance all this time, and it wasn't providing the thrill that they needed anymore. And so they had to get closer and closer and closer. Some of the common crimes that go along with voyeurism is burglary, usually breaking and entering, so that they can get closer to their target and watch from a closer vantage point. Sometimes a voyeur will break into somebody's house, watch them, and then maybe they were getting dressed to go to work, let's say. And so they've gotten dressed, they leave the house, lock up, and the voyeur now is locked inside the house. And so then now they have an opportunity to maybe not even steal anything, but maybe just go through all of the victim's belongings, like especially their intimate apparel, things like that, so that they can feel closer, feel more dominant of their victim. Occasionally, voyeurs will escalate to rape, and one of the tricky parts about voyeurs is that you don't know which one this person might be. So it might be just a passive voyeur who all they're going to do is peep and they're never going to escalate, and others might escalate to the point where they actually attack their victim. Sometimes they will engage in arson, and this is when they burn something down and derive sexual pleasure from it. It's called paraphilia. So they actually love. Philia means love. So pyrophilia is love of fire. And the thing that arson does for a voyeur is that they can start the fire and then step back and like watch their own power as the thing that they caught on fire gets consumed. There's an added layer of excitement when the fire department arrives and they watch them put it out, and it makes them feel powerful is basically the psychological factor that contributes to arson being arousing. They have found that voyeurs who display paraphilia will oftentimes be so aroused by the act of catching the place on fire that they will masturbate and ejaculate right there at the scene. And there have been cases of serial arsonists who were caught through the DNA that they were leaving behind at the scenes. Sometimes you know that you have a paraphiliac on your hands when consistently there's this one person who always seems to be first on scene when there's a fire? When the fire department gets there, they keep seeing the same person. So they may be the paraphiliac. We had a case that made the national news back in the 90s. A man who was from Cle Elum, lived with his parents. He would leave Cle Elum, go over the mountains to the west side, and he would start fires in different places. And each trip he would make one fire and watch it and stuff. It was one of those cases where they were finding semen at the scene. And it wasn't until somebody noticed in the news footage, it was his dad, I think, who noticed in the news footage that his son kept being at the scene. And he had noticed that his son was never home when these arsons were happening, but he kept seeing his son in the news footage. And he's like, I've got to call someone. I think my son is setting these fires. And it turned out he was. And it turns out the son had burned down a shed on the family's property, and so it wasn't like out of nowhere that the family thought he might be an arsonist. But the fact that they were finding semen at the scene goes along with this idea that he was feeling powerful. He kept being the first one. He'd oftentimes be interviewed by the news. I mean, imagine in his head how that probably was made him feel very powerful, smarter than everyone else, things like that. All right, sort of the flip side of the voyeur would be the exhibitionist. Exhibitionistic disorder is what they call it in the DSM-5. This oftentimes we will call a flasher. So this is a person who flashes their genitals to an unsuspecting person. So as we see in this picture, you've got two unsuspecting women just walking down the street, and then this guy, this is like the classic, he's in a trench coat with nothing underneath it. That's not usually what they really do, but it's sort of like the stereotype. And the idea is they want to see the reaction of the unsuspecting person. They really like a look of shock, so that then later they can use that facial expression to fuel their fantasies. And so looking shocked or scared is something that they really like. Now, there are different types of exhibitionists. There's the type 1, who is what they call the inhibited exposer, and they tend to be flaccid. So they call them the inhibited flaccid exposure. So here we have a person who doesn't have an erection. They are just showing their genitals to somebody else. And you'll notice they call it inhibited, that in general life, in regular life, this is a person who's very inhibited, very unsure of themselves. Type 2 is the sociopathic type, where you have a history of other kinds of misconduct. The type 2 person is much more likely to want to shame their victim. They're much more likely to dehumanize their victim. They feel like the victim is just there to be taken advantage of, things like that. Now, I thought I'd share with you in the next video they'll queue up is from over on the west side of Washington, a series of bikini barista flasher incidences. So I thought you might enjoy seeing this news coverage of that. So I will see you on the other side of that.